I am the U.S. Program Director for the Regulatory Assistance Project, and I am beyond thrilled to see this room full of people who are as excited about the topic of energy justice as I am. This idea started with a conversation with my colleague Louise probably 6 weeks ago. We were like, we're going to Climate Week and nobody's talking about this and we should talk about this. And so just want to offer first a thank you to the Crux Alliance because we brought this to them and they immediately were on board and brought us the most wonderful speakers. So just want to offer a big thank you. I am going to allow the speakers, you will be able to scan this code and learn more about their bios, but one of the things that I thought was really critical and important in today's work is that we are coming at it from a variety of perspectives. When we think about energy justice, there is not just a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not just thinking about affordability, it's thinking about what does it mean to have secure housing? What does it mean to be able to move across spaces that you can feel like you get to work on time? What does it mean to have appliances that work? What does it mean to think about, you turn on the power and the power is there and you're not making trade-offs in terms of food or medicine. So I love that we have the multiple perspectives. And so I am gonna actually talk a little bit about the organizations and then allow the panelists to come up and introduce themselves. So the first organization that's represented is CLASS. And CLASS works globally to set appliance standards as appliances have huge emission numbers. We also know that they are huge pollutants inside the homes. And so when we think about the confluence of both health and emissions, appliances is a major area where we work on. We also have someone represented from the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. And transportation is one of those things that tends to get lost in the conversations. In the US, I know frequently we talk about bike lanes and having that access, but if you can't afford to live in the city, what does that mean if there's no bus available for you? What does that mean if the subways are now an hour apart after 7 p.m.? We also have somebody who works on the communities from In Color. So she's going to talk about her work working with utilities and community-based organizations to understand the biases implicit in some of this work that we do. And then lastly, we have somebody from Global Buildings Performance Network to talk about buildings. The buildings is the #1 emitter, is frequently thrown out, but we also forget and think about, again, what does it mean to be housing secure? What does it mean as we build buildings and where we place them? And so I would like to invite our first panelist up. That's you guys. So first, our first panelist is going to be Magari Jindu, who's with the Global Buildings Performance Network to talk about buildings and equity.
Thank you so much, Damali. So as mentioned, my name is Magari Jindu. My background is in architecture and urban planning, working on the African continent for the last 17 years. And my interest really around this particular conversation is with regards to how buildings have the capacity to impact people, particularly with regards to health, and that is the work that GBPN does. Just sort of an introduction around GBPN and how the organization, the Global Buildings Performance Network, embraces equity through our work is really around our bottom-up approach. And what we mean by bottom-up approach is rather than enter countries or communities and try to provide solutions, really have solutions from the bottom up, from the people who are most affected in those communities, and then as an organization provide the needed technical expertise to support those solutions. And what that does is that the work that we do then creates an impact because it's driven by the people most affected in those communities. And how we do that is really building powerful coalitions, working with local experts in those particular communities, and then providing the support as GBP and at technical expertise level. Through our work related to health and housing, we really try to respond to the need for housing to improve health. And doing that through a couple of different ways, mostly around policy reform, industry transformation, but really looking at the salient issues with regards to housing, which is bioclimatic design, renewable energy, and technologies like grid interactivity. So I will speak a little bit more about GBPN, but I always like to also contextualize the African context with regards to this topic, energy justice and the future of climate. And I'll speak about it a little bit more broadly outside of the building scenario, and I'll come back to buildings after this. Reason being, the African continent, just in terms of perspective, 600 million in Africa, 600 million people in Africa live without security with regards to energy. And that's without access to modern energy services or clean cooking, which I'm sure Vishal will talk about. Therefore, in this discussion, when you talk about energy justice and the future of climate, the decisions that are being made right now in this week, in the conversations that are happening throughout the city, really have the potential to shape Africa's energy transition for decades to come. And I like sometimes to humanize what this means, because it's very easy, because we're all experts in different fields wherever we come from, and it's really important to humanize what we're trying to do when we speak to this particular topic. So allow me to sort of tell a little story with regards to energy justice on the African continent and what that looks like when it does not exist. So I'll tell a story of a lady called Wanjiko. Wanjiko, in this context, lives in central Kenya, rural Kenya. She's a small-scale farmer who farms in rural Kenya. Wanjiko lives in an area where energy supply is unreliable and most of the time quite costly when you look at the economies of scale. She struggles with pumping water to her farm for irrigation, struggles to pump water supply from the village supply to her household. Unreliable energy also affects her children's health because the local clinic doesn't have refrigerated vaccines. Also, an unreliable clean water supply affects her children. Additionally, she worries about her children and their security when they're walking to and from school. In a lot of rural African communities, schools do tend to be in far-off locations. So you're talking about leaving early in the morning, coming late at night. All these challenges as a mother, and in a lot of the African societies, it's a matriarchal society in terms of running the home and not necessarily decision making. The challenges take a mental toll on her, and she worries every day about making her ends meet. I mentioned she's a small-scale farmer who takes her produce out to be milled. She's a maize farmer. The cost of running the mill is also expensive because most of the time, if there is no energy, we move back into fossil fuels, and the miller will pass on that cost to her. So her life is impacted in so many different ways just by just putting into context what her day looks like. It's impacted with regards to her health and the health of her children, the education of her children, the economic transformation is impossible, mental impact, child endangerment. Her children are walking back and forth in spaces that may not be very secure. And in some families, when you're looking at poverty and poverty created through inaccessible energy, sometimes this goes even a step farther, where families have to get to a point where they start making decisions with regards to early child marriage to rescue their families. So the sort of really rolling, cascading effects of living in such a society is what I want to sort of bring to this room for everybody to have some thought around that. That as we speak to the broader issues, let's come back to the people scale and what this does to the most vulnerable communities with regards to the women and the children who are affected on a day-to-day basis. Her story is not unique. This happens quite widely throughout Africa, not just in Kenya, but across the board, where farming is a subsistence. So I don't want to leave it on that note because I will come back to buildings. I do want to say that there's a lot of innovation, really great things that are happening on the continent that are addressing, as I mentioned, people-centered solutions. I want to mention one, even as I sort of will come back to buildings later in the conversation. There's a startup in Kenya as well called eSafiri. eSafiri is a women-led enterprise. And what they do is they actually use solar-powered energy to run tricycles for female farmers to be able to get their produce back and forth from their farms, 6 to 8 kilometers to the aggregate center. They use solar bicycles to do this, and they also use the solar energy to be able to provide refrigeration to get the supplies to the markets without being compromised. That simple solution, driven from the local community, allows it to really transform the economy of those women. So while yes, there are challenges, there's also a lot of innovation that's happening on the continent, and I'll bring it back to GBPN, if you'll allow me to, with regards to what GBPN does in connection to energy justice. We've been developing the energy base for healthy buildings and making sure buildings are ready for future climates. I was just talking earlier as well with regards to our program in India. We have a program in India called Healthy Buildings, Healthy Lives, that really focuses on identifying the issues with regards to overheating in spaces. One win that I really want to mention with regards to this is GBPN was invited by the Bureau of India Standards, BIS, to do a white paper with regards to making recommendations with regards to healthy buildings. Now, based off of that white paper, GBPN has now been asked to pilot the recommendations. So now, practically speaking, to implement this on 4,000 affordable housing units, working with now industry, with one of the largest building developers in India, and really looking at how then, once that is piloted off the affordable housing, how that will impact policy reform. And the policy reform will be able to, has the potential to influence an additional 30 million units of housing, affordable housing units in India in the long run. I'll end by speaking with regards to the opportunity. Africa and most of the global south has a building stock deficit of about 80% of building stock is yet unbuilt. So we do have the opportunity to do it right. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My voice is better today, so let's hope I can go through that without coughing a lot. I'm sorry if that happens. Thanks so much, Damali, for this invitation and the Crux Alliance, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Clarice Link, and I lead the ITDP in the Institute for Transportation and Development Office in Brazil, the Development Policy, Office in Brazil. I have been working with ITDP for 12 years. We're based in Rio, and we promote sustainable urban mobility. So of course, we are looking at the sustainability impact of mobility, but we are very worried about making it equitable. And I think that's why I'm so happy to be here and have the possibility of having this discussion, looking at mobility from this perspective. I mean, there is no question for us that climate change is a reality, that the cities is where we have the problems, but potentially we have solutions as well. And urban mobility is really in a central place of discussion. But I think, although we are in a group that are talking a lot about public transport for the last couple of days, what we see is that a lot of public and private investments are for the decarbonization are in fact still emphasizing a paradigm on private vehicles as the future of mobility. And I think this is really something for us to be concerned about. Even when we change the technology, the vehicular technology, when we secure energy efficient vehicles, we continue to focus on individual mobility. And this really widens the gap in access to essential services, right? It is, I would say, an outdated vision and potentially dangerous approach, leading to a deficient, to an exclusionary, and to an environmentally harmful system, mobility system. So in Brazil, the transport is really responsible for half of the country's emissions related to energy. And what we have seen is that the motorization rate has steadily increased. In the last decade, the rate grew by more than 50% in every city, every capital city. Motorized vehicles are high cost, low occupancy mode of transport, and consumes excessive space, prioritizes speed over safety. So this is already a first important aspect here. In the last decade, there was a 15% rise in traffic-related fatalities in Brazil compared to the previous decades, more than 40,000 deaths annually. 1/3 of deaths are people up to 15-year-old. Motorcycle accidents account for almost half the deaths in the 15 to 29 age group. The cost to the country is about $10 billion a year. And it goes without saying that most victims are young men of color in Brazil. Air pollution, as a second problem, killed over 44,000 people in Brazil alone in 2016. So exposure to particulate matter, local pollutants, we know, trigger a lot of health problems, impacts the central nervous system, reproductive system, headaches, sore throats, and all of that. And the list associated, it is long, alarming, and harmful, specifically to, more importantly, to babies, toddlers, young children who breathe 4 times faster than an adult body, are more exposed to air pollutants. The elderly population as well, who are have more deficient immune systems, and the population living in the peripheric areas of the metropolitan cities, who in Brazil are low-income population, people of color, and who are the main public transport users, who spend long hours commuting daily. So that's why they are more exposed as well. Even with the transition to the clean electric private vehicles, we know that we don't have the energy capacity to have the whole society motorized. We don't even have space for that, but in terms of energy use. So there is a limit in terms of what the environment can give us. And it's really difficult to believe that the energy use and equity can grow at the same pace. The focus on the private vehicles as the solution disproportionately benefits the wealthier communities. And I think this is extremely important for us to take into account when we are considering the inequality in our regions, right? I come from Brazil, and I mean, Latin America, one of the most unequal regions, and Brazil in particular. Most people in lower and middle income countries like us either walk or use public transport, but the infrastructure and the services are insufficient, expensive, precarious, and that's why the investments should be prioritizing this type of systems. And I think this is something that should be really, it should be at the top of our agenda. 1/3 of the population in large cities like Rio de Janeiro, where I come from, or São Paulo, spend more than 1 hour one-way commuting daily. So the 15-minute city idea that we have been pushing and that we all love is very distant to the reality of the global south, the so-called global south. I live in a 2 to 3 hour city. I don't live in a 15-minute city, and it's not gonna be something that we can change from one moment to another. Not to say that this shouldn't be our focus. Transit costs often cost 1/4 of families, poor families' monthly income in Brazil, 20 to 25%. This high cost of transit limits the population access to other activities that are not work-related, right? So going to health clinics, visiting families, these are the first trips that will be dropped if resources are limited for the family. And the transport systems also prioritize the daily trips from home to work. So we are always focusing on the productive city, the consumption city, peak hours, and like operations that really secure these productive cities, but we do not respond to the interest and the specific needs of caregivers, normally women, in Brazil, normally Black women, people also with disability, children, elderly. So it limits these specific groups' access to the cities. And I think that we have very poor understanding about mobility of care still. Infrastructure is also not well distributed, and it ends up emphasizing the social spatial mismatch that we have between central areas and peripheric areas in our countries. Racial inequalities are evident when we analyze the data about the population who live near to the public transport infrastructure or active transport infrastructure. In all Brazilian capital cities, we have fewer people of color living near transport systems than compared to white groups. And this goes to all types of infrastructure. When we plot them in the map, that's how we see the results. And I think it's really crucial we push towards having more gender and race disaggregated data, and that we advance our understanding and our analysis of this data. They are telling a lot about inequality in our spaces. When we are adding income and gender variables, coverage is always lower for Black women in Brazil, in all Brazilian cities as well, and who are the heads of households and earn a monthly income of up to one minimum age. So they are not only the one most affected by the low supply of transport in their areas, but also they are more vulnerable to the risks of violence, racism in the transport system, and social exclusion. Electric cars alone, we know they're not gonna save the climate, and we need significant investments in public transport, cycling, walking. They're all key for equitable cities. And of course, the importance of mobility is all in the main global agendas. 7 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals have specific targets, indicators on transport. It is in the Paris Agreement and all of that, but yet the sustainable transport infrastructures are very much underfunded. And I think there is a whole discussion about pricing based measures that we have at this point, which are extremely important in terms of encouraging more sustainable travel choices by the individuals and also increasing revenue sources for mobility. But I think it's important for us to point out that in the context of many of our countries, pricing requires caution. It needs to be designed as a redistributive mechanism. This is extremely important. In Brazil, for example, we have experienced decades of incentives for purchasing cars. So the first opportunity the person has, the person will want to get out of that precarious public transport system and go to a car or to a motorbike, and that's fair because this person needs to reach work every day, and how is that going to happen if not through this in debt that the person goes. So the people in the lower income brackets have massively migrated to private vehicles and motorbikes. And these are the population also who live far from the city centers. So the pricing mechanisms have potentially, they can have the result of benefiting wealthier communities. And I think we need to make sure that we have it very much ear tagged to the investment on public transport, the investment on active transport, and the prioritization in the peripheric areas, and yeah, with all that I mentioned before, so that we don't emphasize inequality in our cities, and we emphasize, on the contrary, the redistributive character here. I think that's it. These are my points. I'm happy to discuss further and also to discuss the connection with other agendas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Vishal Thapa. I'm with CLASP in the India office. I'm an economist by training. I kind of arrived accidentally into the climate and energy space. I grew up thinking I wanted to be a film critic until I realized it's probably slightly easier to solve the climate crisis than to make a living being a film critic. So as a parting gift to my long cherished dream, I wrote a master's thesis on how film criticism affects movie earning, so I can talk to you all about that. And then I made peace with my fate, and here I am, 2 decades later, talking about climate. And thank you, Damli, and the Crux Alliance for surfacing this very important issue of equity and energy justice. Equity considerations cannot be an afterthought anymore. And it is not always that we are fortunate enough to have the opportunity to lean into an urgent global crisis, in this case, the climate crisis, to be able to repair a wound that we should have fixed a long time ago. The injustice and inequality that we see that prevails today is further exacerbated by the climate impacts. And so let me illustrate that. I think for many of us, this was a difficult summer. In Delhi, where I live and work, we hit 107 degrees plus for 37 consecutive days. I've never experienced a summer like that, and I've lived in Delhi for the last 15 years. I also experienced what it meant to actually feel severe dehydration. It's a very weird disease. It's 100 degrees and you're shivering. Like, you don't have a fever, but you're shivering. And you're putting on all sorts of sweaters, blankets, and that's a sign that it's not good. Obviously, I'm fortunate. I have access to cooling, I have access to good medical care. But many people in India and around the world don't. And so this summer, India lost 100 people, died from severe heat. There were 40,000 reported cases of heat stress. And those numbers are probably an underestimate, quite a significant underestimate, because in most times we don't, it's very difficult to link back a death or an illness to heat stress, because there's some other cause that normally takes it over. These deaths are disproportionately borne by the poor. Right? And so for millions around India, for millions around the world, it's the simple breeze of twirling from a fan or some access to clean drinking water can be the difference between life and death. It's very real. These impacts are very real. So our work at CLASP really puts us at the center of these kinds of issues. We have the ability to bring appliances that can alleviate some of these problems, that can help people adapt and adjust to these climate impacts that we see every day. So access to appliances like a fan could make a huge difference. Access to appliances like air conditioning can make a huge difference. What we're working is to try to enhance the energy efficiency of these appliances, which is reducing cost, which in effect is also improving access. So for example, if you switch from a low efficiency air conditioner to a high efficiency air conditioner in India, your cost of ownership of that appliance over its life reduces by over 50%. In India, we worked recently on a program that was trying to build procurement to enhance the adoption of energy efficient fans. And we found that just the announcement of the program, let alone the actual deployment, just the announcement of the program led to a reduction in cost from 3,500 rupees to 2,200 rupees. Just the announcement of the program. And these fans now are far more available in the market than they were before. So access to these appliances are important. But today, actually, I want to take you on a slightly different dimension. Not so much about the end users, but about the making of these appliances and why that's also equally important to the consideration on energy justice and inequity. And the story I want to tell you is through these fans. Fans in India reach 90% of the households. They're available in almost every home. 40% of residential energy consumption comes from fans. Clearly, India is a hot country. If you haven't visited, don't visit it in the summertime. And as we transition in this energy transition, we need to move towards higher and more efficiency fans. These fans are available. There are 45 million fans that are sold annually in India. It's a big number. 50% of their production comes from small and medium enterprises, unorganized sectors. As we make the transition to more higher efficiency, brushless DC type of fans that use new kinds of magnets instead of the traditional motors, we're talking about a big shock to these small and medium enterprises that risk being unable to keep up with the transition. Let me just illustrate to you what that impact might look like, and it's not necessarily just looking at the fan production sector alone. India recently completed and launched its survey of unincorporated sector enterprise. They do this about every 5 years, just looking at how the unorganized sector is faring. This was a survey that was released looking at the year 21-22, which is the fiscal year in India, compared to 15-16, which was the last time it was done. What this survey released was actually very troubling. First, we found out that in this unorganized sector, the incomes went down on average by 10,000 rupees a month. That's a pretty big amount for a small sector. The number of workers went down from 119 million to 109 million, so a 2 million reduction in the workforce. And it isn't that these workers were then being incorporated into the organized sector, it was that they were going back to far more less remunerative agricultural employment. And the reason for this impact was because of a couple of economic shocks that hit the system during this time. One related to COVID, but the other related to economic shocks that resulted from the way that the government had taken out some of the currency from circulation. The impact of the highlight from this story is that relative to the organized sector, this unorganized sector disproportionately bears the burden, and it's very visible through surveys like this. And they're accounting for 50% of the fans' production. Almost 60% of that workforce in this sector works in manufacturing, so fans would be one of them. A quarter of them are women. So the impacts that ripple through these are tremendous. So what we're looking to do as we make policy is to see and be more attentive to the needs of these stakeholders. Right now we have a work that we've been working quite steadily in this sector. And the way we're trying to address it is twofold. One, we're trying to get governments to be more responsive to this sector as they make these policies. They have not traditionally done that. So what does that mean? That means going to this sector as they regulate the efficiency. They're going to talk to the sector, help them understand what it means to become, to get this kind of certifications and efficiency. The new policy that the government has launched removes 90% of the fans that were currently being produced in India. So in effect, 90% of the production is going to be out, which means that impact is going to be borne significantly better. So one task we're doing is trying to make government agencies that are making these standards, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, for example, and the Bureau of Indian Standards, responsive to these needs of these stakeholders, helping them understand what it means to enhance their capabilities in terms of certifications and in terms of it. The second thing that we're doing with them is working with these stakeholders to understand where is the technology that they need, where is the upskilling that they need, and then trying to secure the kind of financing flows that are need to be able to match make those inputs. So, in doing this, obviously, we're working, in partnership with local stakeholders, local communities, local associations that are working directly with these kinds of small and medium enterprises. But the main, I think, idea to take away from this is that we can't make policy and then figure out this is the impact and then go and fix it. It has to be embedded as we do it. And I think that is the change we need to try to bring. Clearly, the energy transition is not an option. We have to move to more efficient fans. That is without question. But how we make that transition, who we choose to include or exclude, is entirely our option. And this is where I think we have to be better at repairing and reformulating the work we do so that we are more inclusive of the sectors of society that may otherwise not be able to keep up with the transition. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. There were so many thoughts and ideas as each of you were speaking. So we are going to open it up to the audience for questions, but I will cede the first question, which is, how in either your country or region do particular cultural norms either offer opportunities for this work or hinder this work? And what are some of your thoughts around how to engage around to support, the norms and culture in the country, but without making sure that we're not hindering the work that we're doing?
Thank you so much, Damali. It's a difficult question for me to respond to, particularly when I look at the building sector, only because when I think about inclusion with regards to the built environment in Africa, one of the things that's always sort of a blinking red signal in my head is always the numbers with regards to representation where gender is concerned. In built environment and infrastructure, the African continent on the low side has 3% of women represented. On the upper side, it's about 15%. So there's sort of a huge gap, and that's from all sectors, like the whole value chain, from what's happening on construction sites to what's happening in manufacturing of building materials, to professionals, to policymakers. It's across the full value chain of buildings. Now some of that is in fact, I think it's really not a cultural thing to exclude women in buildings in Africa. A lot of traditional home construction was actually done by African women in the home from local materials. So it almost speaks to me that maybe there's an opportunity to reflect back on traditional practices and embrace those to a more inclusive society in the building industry. So I think that is how I would respond to that, is that I feel traditionally there are a lot of things that were good in how inclusion happened, but over the years that has changed and the statistics are speaking for themselves. So there needs to be a concerted effort to ensure that we fill that gap.
That's a great and difficult question. I think regarding the transport sector in Brazil, there are maybe 3 points that come to my mind. The first is really about representation in the sector, right? So we don't have that many women working in the sector, so this is a first and important point in terms of planning, of designing, operations. We don't have that many Black women working, although Black women are the majority of public transport users and the ones that are most. So they pay higher, they spend more time in the system, they are more exposed to racism and to harassment as well, but they are not the ones designing the system. So I think this is one important issue that needs to be addressed, and I think this discussion is out there. And I think in terms of the sector transition, for example, to electrification, it's very important we understand what are the opportunities that arise for us to open up the space for women, for example, working in the sector. What type of capacity do we need, and what opportunities do we have there? So I think there is some discussion starting around that. The second thing that I think when we are promoting, like, we should be using public transport, we should be walking and cycling, that's not what the majority of people want to do in Brazil, right? So I don't have a car and I'm considered an alien in my group. It's like, you don't have a car, how do you move around? And it's something very awkward. It's like, you are an activist, that's why you don't have a car, which might be true, but I think there is that point about safety, right? So if you think about Rio de Janeiro, what comes to your mind? Oh, I'm gonna die in Rio. Can I go to Rio? Is it a safe place to go? So do you really wanna be in a bus for 1 hour? I was already harassed in a bus, and it was not only once. I was robbed in buses when I was a teenager 5 times. 5. I have 2 teenagers. They take a bus, and I'm like, you have to share your localization, but don't get the phone. Don't take the phone out of your pocket. Don't. So we are panicking the whole time. Do we want our kids to bike? Do we want our kids to walk? Again, I'm a warrior because my kids take buses. Nobody in their school take buses, because how come you put a teenager in a bus? It's so dangerous. So the idea that going to a private space is very strong as the safe space, right? It's a car, or it's a playground, or it's a shopping center. It's not in the street. And this is culturally very strong in Brazil. And I think it all goes to the last point, which is the broader picture, which is we are a country that still, we are very unequal, as you all know. And there is, it's a lot about status, which income level you are, how do you live in the cities, what type of pattern you have in terms of consumption, all of that. So also a lot of people don't want to be in the bus, not because it's precarious, it's unsafe, it's expensive, but also because this is for poor people, right? And I mean, this is something that we tend not to talk about that because it's very, it's not a good thing to talk about, right? But that's the reality, and I think that's reality in many countries. And in Latin America, I am sure that's the reality in all the capital cities. You don't want to be seen as poor. You don't want to be perceived as poor. There is a lot about status, and I think culturally, this is really strong. So also thinking about how can we make the public transport fancier, because the middle and higher classes, they come to New York, they go to Europe and they take photos in the subway and they're like, oh, I was just on the subway, just on a bus, it's amazing. But here, no, I'm never gonna touch that. I don't wanna leave. I don't want a subway station close to my building, my neighborhood. So there is this cultural aspect, which is very important, which is class differentiation. And what we are trying to promote are solutions that in fact you will need to share the space with the alterity, with others, with people of all different type of income levels and of background. And this is something that many people in our societies are not interested. So I think also trying, and then what is the strategy? We need to frame the public transport as something fancier, as something like better quality, as something not only safer, cleaner, and etc., but something that has some status. How can we put the bicycle and make walking something that seems more interesting? Because walking is only interesting in New York, of course, not anywhere else, it's awful. So I think looking at the big picture and understanding like culture and understanding history, right, is crucial for us to change the reality today.
Again, great points, and a tough question. I think overall, I would say that, you know, inequity is also, it's a reflection of several embedded elements culturally, socially, economically that have just hardened over many centuries. And I think the fact that we're now in the midst of all of these climate impacts and the way our response to it can in effect perpetuate that. So let me give you an example. Even though I live and work in India, I'm from Nepal. And so I remain obviously very attached to the country. And so Nepal announced a policy that it was going to totally electrify transport. Great idea. So they said one way to do it is to give tax break for all import taxes on electric vehicles. Just zero import taxes, and taxes at that time for other vehicles was close to 250% of the price. And so, I was one of the few people that said, it's a terrible idea. Like, we shouldn't give tax breaks on electric vehicles, in part because only 3% of the population owns cars. And so you in effect perpetuate that when those taxes actually could be used for something much better. So quite naturally, I got exiled from my country, and not many people in Nepal are happy speaking with me about electric vehicles and taxes. So it's sometimes that these climate policies continue, even though they might be for a good reason, just continue to perpetuate that inequality. But sometimes the political social economy does work in interesting ways to try to overcome it. So here's the example from India. AC ownership, room air conditioner ownership, is about 10%. Right? We have an opportunity to significantly boost AC efficiencies, obviously, and the new ACs that are coming onto the horizon, that are just coming onto the horizon in India, is 4 times more efficient, but they come at twice the cost. And so everybody's asking the question, what do we do? And the natural impulse, I think, for many people is to just incentivize it. And actually the government's holding back, saying we're not going to incentivize cost reductions in AC for end users because it just disproportionately taken by those who get an AC. And so we look at other measures of it, and this is one instance where I think the political economy is very considerate about thinking what would be the implication and ramifications of such an incentive, who will be the beneficiaries of it, and whether just meeting the goal of accelerating efficiency is in fact sufficient while still continuing to perpetuate them. And there might be other policy options, such as, for instance, public procurements that you do to influence ACs in places that are much more publicly used. For example, again, if you look at Delhi, the best places for cooling, if you're ever stuck in a hot day in Delhi, is go to the metro. Use what is called the red bus. Like, I'm telling you, you'll freeze in there. But it's great. It's a massive investment. But for the millions of people who take it, it is actually the moment of relief from that summer heat. And so these kind of public procurement that are now beginning to push public procurement into public schools, for example, may be far better ways to look at accelerating efficiency while at the same time ensuring that the investments you make towards it are actually being more broadly applicable to beneficiaries, and people those in need are actually getting them.
So we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. I'm going to ask my panelists to limit your answers to about a minute, just so we can get through. I think we have time for about 3 questions-ish. So are there any questions from the audience?
Questions coming.
Yes. You could stand up and introduce yourself.
Sure. Hey, my name's Max. I live in Salt Lake. I work in the private sector. Our company is interested in learning more about energy and specifically the grid. So my question is, how are you all thinking about updates to the grid in your countries in order to cheapen the way that energy gets from a production center to places further out of the city? Like, for example, the woman you're talking about who has a small farm, how can energy get to her more cheaply or more efficiently?
I think I'll try to answer as best as I can. But I think one of the challenges in most African countries, but I'll speak with regards to Kenya, is probably around decentralization of sort of ensuring that the different centers of getting energy out to the different regions. So we do struggle with that because what tends to happen is there's monopolization of the energy sector in the country, and provision and distribution from the grid is by one service provider, at least in Kenya specifically, is from one service provider. So what tends to happen if there's any issue or concern with regards to that particular service provider, then just as an example, this year alone we've had nationwide power loss 4 times in the last 9 months, and that's really because there's a monopoly. There's the decentralization of energy is not really something that we speak about in Kenya.
I'm not sure I can completely address your point, but I think what comes to my mind in relation to transport is, yesterday we were talking about it. I think if we're focusing on public transport, right, and if you're looking at the periphery, you are looking already at areas where you don't always have the capacity, for example, to really electrify the fleet. And this brings an opportunity for grid modernization in areas that are poor, and that's where we have bus depots, that's where you have the need, for example, for truck recharging infrastructure as well, because that's where normally we have more heavy-duty vehicles circulating. So if we really, and now we're seeing in Brazil the big transition, or we are hoping to see this big transition happening in terms of electric buses, and we are seeing, like, unless the energy sector comes really together and we see it as an opportunity to improve the grid in the peripheries, this is not going to be really addressing, like, having the equitable outcomes that we need. So I do think that first, when we're talking about public transport, is already a way of democratizing access overall. But when we look at the grid modernization in the peripheries, is something that can really make a big difference and result in a big investment that will have a ripple effect where the majority of the poor population lives, right? So we have in all the peripheries of the metropolitan areas. So these are the areas that need most investment. We are not only talking about vehicles, we are talking about the charging infrastructure, and looking at these areas is where we can really have an important impact for different sectors as well.
Yeah, I think you surface up a really important question, because the last mile reliability on electricity supply is one of the key constraints to delivering the types of services you need through appliances or equipment. Let me give you an example. When I first moved to Delhi in 2005, you'd be surprised that Delhi was actually a winter peaking. Means that more people had heaters than they did have cooling. And you might think, oh, that was because Delhi had not quite become as wealthy to be able to afford ACs, but that's not true. The reason Delhi had winter peaking was because you didn't have enough reliable supply of electricity in the summertime. And so if power is going out for 6 hours at night, what are you going to do investing in an AC? You just put off the purchase. If you look at e-cooking, for example, one of the biggest challenges to e-cooking is the last mile supply infrastructure. If everybody in rural areas switched on their cooking at approximately the same time, all of the transformers would explode. It's not possible. And so we need to be able to invest in last mile infrastructure. We need to be able to enhance the capacity of last mile distribution networks, particularly, to be able to flow the electricity in there. The challenge is that these countries are constrained. You've got massive investment requirements in the supply side. You've got to build power plants because demand is growing so fast. And so just to focus on supply side investments, like building more power plants, continues to perpetuate these kind of differences in this kind of equipment. So one of the things we can do is find ways to offset or find ways to kind of get around the problem of last mile reliability, for instance, by ensuring there is more energy efficient appliances embedded at the last mile. That reduces your need for how much electricity you're transferring. But second, by embedding local generation right at the source or closer to the source, and that avoids some of this investments in infrastructure. Investment in infrastructure is the toughest to make. It's easy to invest in a power plant, very, very difficult to invest in last mile infrastructure and distribution. And so, but I think it's critical that we look at the full portfolio of solutions, energy efficiency at last mile, embedded generation, distributed generation, as ways to maybe continue to make the investments in the point that you're making. Thank you.
Other? Yes.
Hi, my name is Isaac. One of the things that grassroots movements in the United States are starting to talk about is the decommodification of electricity and the return of electricity to mass public ownership. So remunicipalization is the term that they often use in Europe. I'm curious if some of these conversations are beginning in your countries as well. Thinking about what do we have to do to equitably electrify everything in our homes, in our buildings, in our transport sector. The decommodification of electricity seems like an important piece of this, and so I'm wondering if something similar is happening in your civil society.
I can take a shot at this. It's great you're asking this question in New York, because in New York is where the battle between AC power and DC power happened, right? Between Edison and Tesla. So it's a great place to be talking about it. That battle actually is playing out maybe a couple of centuries later in our places. In India, for example, there's a lot of focus about trying to see how to get embedded generation on rooftops. So there was a huge program that was launched that looked at putting rooftop generation in about 10 million homes. And the idea was because India suddenly needed, with its growth in demand, it needed about 30 more gigawatts. And so just before COP, India announced that it was going to restart its coal program. And so one way to offset it is to put solar on rooftops. That's one aspect. So there's a lot of work that's being done. Like one of the areas that we are working on is to look at what are the standards for DC appliances so that you can use more directly. So that conversation is coming back. The challenges with policies is still a problem, right? Like how do consumers feed back into the grid? What are the ways in which consumers can trade with one another, the surplus electricity they have and somebody can buy it? The establishment of standards for that is not yet adequately in place. We think in this situation, the technologies and its ability to deploy these technologies are actually quite robust. The regulations have not caught up. And we're not finding yet a critical mass of civil society that is pushing that agenda to try to operationalize the deployment of these technologies. So I think in this case, the constraints are regulatory limitations on how we can use these systems and the business models you could multiply. So in countries that have slightly more liberal and more encompassing regulations, you see a much wider range of business models in terms of peer-to-peer trading and the diffusion of different technologies. In countries that are not enough, you're not seeing it. And we think that would be a great source, but we need to double down on regulatory change, more so than I think the technologies that we.
So that's actually a great segue into our next set of speakers. I'm going to ask people to hold their questions. We're going to have more time for questions, but I would love to first thank our first set of panelists. And I'd like to invite Quinn Parker and Louise Sunderland to come up and actually talk a little bit more about that specific subject. So we are going to do a little bit of a fireside chat, actually specifically talking about that subject around policy and community and engagement and what we see as levers and what kind of needs to happen in order to support this. And so I'm joined by my colleague, Louise Sunderland from RAP, Quinn Parker, founder and CEO of Encolor Consulting. And so I'm actually going to start with asking Quinn a question around, can you walk us through the work that you do and what you see as challenges and opportunities for the corporations and organizations that you work with?
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. As Damali said, my name is Quinn Parker. I am the founder and CEO of In Color. We are a strategic consulting firm. We work with organizations across the country, primarily utilities and the consultants that service utilities, to ensure products and services are delivered equitably, especially to communities that are most vulnerable. I feel privileged every day that I get the opportunity to work directly with the community, as well as seeing how programs are being operationalized. But the challenge that we run into is that oftentimes these programs, products, services are a direct result of some policy or legislation that came down through some type of regulatory process, right? And oftentimes these policies, while well-intended and are stated as equitable, are not intentional. They don't include any metrics, lack of accountability, no real way to ensure that equity is operationalized. And so what we find is a group of individuals that are charged with implementing some type of clean energy initiative with a great idea of equity, but no real mechanism to make it happen. And even if they want to invest, they don't know how. They don't know how to actually ensure that it's going to the right populations. They're not able to collect the appropriate data. So we think that we need to look back at policy more. So my organization, while oftentimes is working with the community, working with these organizations, is now going backwards and saying we need to start at the policy level. We need to make sure that policies are written in a way where folks that are on the ground can intentionally execute equitable outcomes without having to kind of work around the system, because oftentimes that's what we're doing. We're trying to work around a system that's not equitable, that includes a lot of different inequities, both structurally and procedurally. So that's one of the primary issues we see out in the field.
That's a brilliant setup, because I'm Louise Sunderland. I work for the Regulatory Assistance Project, and as you can tell from our name, our work is looking at that regulatory framework. So I'm from, as you can probably hear, I'm from London. I work in Belgium, in Brussels, which is the home of the European Commission, the European Union. And we've been actually over the last kind of 3 or 4 years supporting negotiations of the entire EU climate and energy framework to do, I think, exactly the things that you were just talking about there. I would hate for anyone to go away from this, my speech now, to think that we've solved everything in Europe, because we absolutely haven't, but there has been progress made, and there has been significant progress. I think it's really important to draw attention to where we are making progress and to analyse what we've done, what it looks like now, but also what was the experience of doing it. How did it feel? What were our challenges? And so, in brief, just to give you some of the context, obviously Europe has very, very high striving climate targets, and we need to have the pieces of framework legislation that are made at EU level implemented in 27 countries to then implement those targets. At the same time as needing to open up that legislation, we have a number of important contextual factors that brought attention to exactly the things that you're talking about, how we make climate policy more socially just. That was, of course, the energy price crisis that resulted from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'd had, in the preceding years to that, quite significant social movements, the Yellow Vest movements, protesting against the perception of deeply unjust range of policies, but including climate policies. We've also seen inequalities within populations grow in Europe. So despite the fact that the European project has been quite successful in reducing inequalities between member states, countries, within the populations we are seeing wider and wider inequalities. And that matters to European citizens incredibly. So this is the sort of context into which we started these negotiations. And it's not enough time and far too much detail to go through everything that was achieved. I have written a paper and done a video if you're interested. But I think the kind of takeaways are that it is very clear that there is no one policy. This is not fixed by one subsidy program, one community solar program, and I think to some extent that's been the approach in the past. We need an absolute kind of framework approach where we analyse all of the benefits and the burdens, and we try piece by piece to mitigate. So just to give you a flavour of kind of some of the things that we've achieved in Europe at the moment, we have pieces of legislation or good policies, I would say, in sort of 4 areas. One is bringing attention and measurement. So if you can't name it, you can't measure it, unfortunately, it's just never a policy priority. So we have definitions of important concepts around energy poverty, so where people are really struggling to access sufficient energy or pay for it, and transport poverty, which is still a relatively new issue to policymakers in Europe. We have requirements to measure and those kinds of things. We also have important procedural elements. Who's in the room when these strategies are being made at implementation level? Are there the oversight and accountability bodies to make sure that, to your point, gender is being considered, representative groups are there? Then we have the range of supports, everything from new protections. So we finally, and it's almost embarrassing, well, it is embarrassing to be here saying we finally only have this, a protection from disconnection from your electricity and gas supply if you are vulnerable or on a very low income. It is astonishing to say we only have that just as a result of the last few years. And then a range of other kind of positive measures that I would say aim to put the benefits of energy efficiency and renewable energy sort of first into the hands of those people who need the most rather than last, as it has been definitely the case when we kind of do the economy-wide measures for like where do we find efficiency most cheap, where do we find renewable energy generation most cheap. So I can only say I really agree with you with that. We need to get the frameworks right. However, it is very, very complex. And from that experience of kind of trying to support negotiators and civil society through that, I think is the complexity that's a real challenge for us at the moment.
Well, I was going to ask my question, which leads to that, which is where are some of the biases in the policies? So you addressed how you address some of the issues, but maybe Quinn, you could address some of the biases in the policies and how communities can engage to help remove that or to expose those biases.
Great question.
Sorry.
Where are there biases in the policies and perhaps how community can be incorporated into the process to help mitigate some of those biases? I think one of the first things we have to acknowledge as a community is that a lot of policies that are impacting communities today were not intended to be equitable. Equity wasn't a consideration, and I think we also have to acknowledge some of these policies were intended to be inequitable. They particularly focused on certain communities providing unequal benefits and unequal burdens. So not only are we trying to create policies that attempt to be equitable now, but perhaps dive into equity and social justice, trying to repair past harms. So just kind of putting that out there for context. And the policies that we're putting in place today oftentimes don't take into consideration that folks are so overly burdened by past decisions, they can't even take advantage of the opportunities in front of them. So what do we do? To Damali's point, bring community into this process. I love the stories that we heard this morning around, policies that are impacting people. Remember, we are talking about people. We're talking about individuals that are trying to feed their families. They're trying to get back and forth to work. They're trying to stay healthy. And we know that folks that are suffering from energy insecurity likely have healthcare insecurity, food insecurity. So how do we put together policies that address all these issues in a way that's meaningful? We bring folks into the room that tell you what their issues are. They tell you how they're struggling. They tell you what they need. And we write policies to actually address those issues instead of the ones that we think these folks have.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree. I think I can see challenges there, and this leads maybe to some of the reflections of the experiences we've had over the last kind of few years. Is that I think, particularly at European level, obviously we are working not directly with communities, but with representative groups, and that's, I think, Brussels is, if you don't have experience of working in Brussels, it's fascinating, a kind of really interesting ecosystem of these kind of representative organisations brought together in coalitions. And so I think absolutely that's very important. I think where I saw a huge challenge though was as a result of a very effective campaigning actually from one of these coalitions that brought energy organisations and social organisations, representative organisations of homelessness groups, of social housing together, very effective campaigning to get these issues onto the agenda, to the extent that we received the email of your dreams from the policymakers saying, okay, we've seen your campaign, we're totally on board. Energy poverty alleviation is an absolute priority, and we see our directive, which is all about energy efficiency, as the main way to do this. Tell us how. And going from, and that was literally the email we received. And so once we got back on our chair, having fallen off, then it's actually, you realise this is incredibly challenging, because going from the sort of skills that you need for community engagement, consultation, movement building, campaigning, to the skills that you need to know exactly what is in that legislation, know what's in the scope of that legislation, because if you fill your briefing with campaign asks that are not in the scope of the legislation that's on the table, you've wasted opportunity, you've wasted space. So knowing line by line what you can do, what you can't do, how far you can push is, I think, for us that took a big sort of leap to do that. And once again, I think it was all about the ecosystem of organisations coming together, knowing who to call on, with that level of trust that you are all kind of pushing for better. The other thing, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is the other thing I noticed, it was very complex, very technical, but also honestly much more emotional than I was expecting. Like, there were a lot of emotions. There's a lot of fear, honestly, I think, bringing organisations that don't have social justice or social issues at their core, in the core of their expertise. A lot of fear when we don't have the data, the knowledge, the language sometimes to negotiate and to talk confidently about these issues. And then also, I think from the climate world, we've not won yet. There are people striving very hard still to make important progress on climate. And if introducing a social objective could be seen by them as maybe slowing down progress, which, if we've got to be honest, sometimes I think it does need to, then it's very, very challenging for them. So you kind of get the sort of pushback of, well, it's unfair to expect climate policy to be more fair than other policies. But of course, that thinking just kind of keeps us in where we were in the past and where we are now. So it was, there's a lot of skills I think we need on there to kind of help navigate that process.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we are consultants, right? We're very technical. We have a lot of models that we use, but we're also social change agents. We are having deep conversations. We're talking to people about really emotional topics. We're talking about their homes, their businesses, their families. And so we have to bring that into the room as well. When we talk about frameworks, so at my organization, we really focus on targeted universalism. We think about who in this group, in this community, is most vulnerable, and building products and services to address that most vulnerable population will likely rise the situation of all the folks in the room. And we do this by bringing those folks into the room to have conversations, thinking about metrics on how to measure success and really understanding where the needs are. So I think there's a lot that we can do here as a community, but not unless we actually have the folks that are most impacted by our decisions being part of that conversation.
So I'm going to take a little bit of moderator's privilege. I think one of the things in this space, we talk about vulnerability, and I think it's really critical to think about how we define that. And traditionally, I think one of the models has been it's just poverty. But vulnerability impacts rural, it impacts age, it impacts disabilities, it impacts, you are vulnerable if you have children. You are vulnerable in some countries if you are not married. And so, or your family support systems. And so as we think through this work, I think globally, it's really important to think about what vulnerable means in your particular area or your particular country in the community that you're at, because it's not just income insecurity. One of the things I work on is ability to pay, right? Ability to even apply for these programs looks very different if you don't have access to a laptop. And so when we think about that, I will pause there for moderators. So I will actually ask you one question, and I'm going to bring the other panelists back up to wrap up. But I think for both of you, why is it important to take on a global perspective in this work?
It's a really good question, and we are all working in our context, in our sectors. It's quite easy to become kind of siloed. They don't call it the Brussels bubble for no reason. We look to our context, but actually, just listening to the colleagues on the panel earlier, I wrote down at least 9 separate things that I was like, yes. This is these principles, these concepts are really relevant in my sector. So there's much more, I think, that thematically that we have in common. But I also think the thing that I've learned through originally speaking to my RAP colleagues, particularly in India and China, but then actually through the Crux Alliance, bringing partners together to talk about equity, what I learned is really where my cultural kind of blind spots and biases are. And I think to the question that was asked earlier, when you are in a region or a country where energy is quite commodified, we have largely liberalised markets, there are completely sort of different approaches and mindsets in countries where energy is more about human development and economic development. And I think those kinds of things are really useful to show where we're not looking.
There's some great work happening around the US. There's some fantastic work happening around the globe, and I think we're not leveraging the lessons learned throughout, all the things that I've heard this morning. I also feel, the same types of concepts, the same challenges, the same individuals that may be suffering. We talked about Black women several times. Black women are one of the most vulnerable communities on this planet, not just in the United States. So I think there is a common thread that we need to continue to work together. We are not going to address our global climate challenges as individual countries. We need to work together.
So I'm going to stand and invite our previous panelist back up. We give one more, we'll snag a chair. And just to answer the question, I think we talked about the global perspective and why that was important, but I would love to hear, I know we have some funders in this room and most of us are actually philanthropy funded, so I would love to hear your perspective on what you think funders can help do to support this work in the future.
Thank you, Damali. I think as I answer that, I'll sort of make the case for why they should be doing that particular thing. In sort of my closing remarks, I just want to say that sustainable housing really is something that should be mandatory. It should be a right, especially in light of everything that's happening with regards to climate, with regards to how much time people spend in buildings. There really can't be energy justice without sustainable buildings, and it's really important for that statement just to be out there. Even outside of sustainable buildings responding to climate is the issue of the non-climate building, the non-climate benefits, which is health, the people-centered benefits, and why that's really important. So what should funders do? I think really funders could work towards empowering local communities to be able to answer this particular question to government, which is what is the health and economic benefit of more sustainable buildings? Because if local communities can be able to make that case for themselves, then government will be on board and the movement towards more sustainable buildings as a right will push forward. So I think that would really be what I would say is important, really empowering local communities to answer that particular question to government. What is the health and economic benefits of sustainable buildings? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think what we have seen in our ecosystem of mobility, at least, is that there is a big push for public transport, right? And for electrification, for e-buses. And what I understand is that this is a great opportunity for us to really revamp the idea of public transport, the role that public transport has in our society. And you talk about like a right. Transport is a right, and we should ensure that we can secure that to our communities, right, everywhere. So, for example, speaking from Brazil, how can we really use this entry point as a change in the technology to rethink the system. That means rethinking the regulatory framework, rethinking the relationship between the public and the private, rethinking the sector overall, the production sector, the capacity of the cities. That means having more like stronger governments, really, back in a position that they are the one mandating, they are the one identifying priorities, they are the one defining. Public transport has been in Brazil a private issue, like it's the private sector that deals with that. And the private sector doesn't deliver data, it doesn't, the buses disappear and nobody's held accountable. So I think it is an opportunity for us to revise the sector overall, right? So, okay, let's change the technology and let's see it as an entry point to revise the whole role of transport in our cities. And I think also to revise our understanding about how we want to live in the cities and what are the policies we need to ensure that the population will be using public transport and will be able to also walk and cycle. Even like we know, electrification alone is not gonna solve it, so we need compact cities, we need cities where we have less vehicles circulating. This is crucial. We have been working in ITDP with these scenarios, and one scenario is a high electrification scenario. The other scenario is we are working on land use policies, and what we are saying is unless we combine both scenarios, we are not really gonna meet any of the targets, any of the abatement that we need not to have a more dramatic climate change. So we need to ensure that we have policies that rethink the way our population is distributed in the cities, and that is certainly going to demand that we have less vehicles circulating. So I think these are the opportunities that I see for the whole ecosystem, for the funders, for the local grassroots as well, to reimagine the life in a city. And I think reimagining is something important, and it's something that only can be tangible if it comes from the local, from the users, from the most vulnerable groups. We are all talking about it. So reimagining is something that is very much needed at this point as well.
Yeah, I think we can work in sort of two levels where I think more effort is required. One is at the international level. If we think about the pathway to net zero, basically centers around triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency. If we just do those two things, maybe we can get to net zero, but we'd not have addressed the equity concerns we're talking about. So we'd have wasted the opportunity of a good crisis, and we need to take advantage of this crisis. So I think there's some language that as an ecosystem we need to try to influence. It's a big effort, but I feel like there's some consideration we got to start inserting in there at an international level, so it percolates down to all of the countries. Second is at the country levels. I do think that we need to do better to try to empower local ecosystems. For us, one of the examples, when we sit in these policy discussions as energy efficiency policies are unfolding, we try very hard to bring in local players, etc. But local players sometimes don't have adequate capacity. And so you can't just show up at a meeting and expect that they'll represent their true concerns. So I think in some of the work we're doing, we're looking at not just thinking technically about a particular issue, but looking at how do we support and create the capacity within the organizations for them to represent their constituency in a way they want to, as opposed to we want them to do it in a certain direction. And I think that ensuring that somehow resources are flowing down to them, making sure they're able to build their organizational capacity to be able to deal with these issues is, I think, super critical also at the national level. And this is where I feel like as an ecosystem, we probably need to do better on both counts.
I think quickly, I agree with both sides. What I was going to say is in fund small, local, diverse businesses, push dollars into those organizations. It has a ripple effect in a lot of different ways. I work with a ton of small businesses small amounts of money means whether they keep their doors open or not. They're hiring folks from the community. They're hiring folks that are innovative and know the solutions that they need. I was at a conference last week that talked about the climate equity gap is both a consequence of and perpetuates the racial equity gap. Like by pushing more money into community, we're able to perhaps mitigate some of the issues that we see in some of our climate infrastructure as well.
Yeah, I think the last point I would make, really picking up on those last 2 points, which is about sort of intentional funding. I think we, with a number of funds, I think we've been in these conversations about, do we need to fund sort of specifically, or do we want equity to be integrated across everything? Every climate policy, every transport policy, we should be it. And I think, obviously, I think that's the nirvana. But I think about how we get from where we are today to there. I think we need really intentional funding. We need, as a person who manages a team, it's really difficult for me to prioritize the recruitment of the skills if those skills are not required in the headline of the policy or the program, or if it doesn't say in the title, if it just says carbon taxation, then I'm going to have an economist, right? But if we have obviously in the title of the grant or the program or the policy that we're working on, then I think that enables everyone to the same point really about bringing in capacity with the skills in the places that we need them. So would be more intentional funding would be my answer.
So I just want to offer a huge thank you to our panelists and speakers for joining us this morning. I want to offer gratitude to the audience. Climate Week is a full marathon sprint at sprint pace. And so joining us this morning, we express gratitude. I also want to say thank you again to the planning committee. Again, we started this about 6 weeks ago, and we pulled it together. And so I want to thank Sarah and Shayna, Becky, Louise, Olivia, who is not here, for all of your work in putting this together. Again, I want to thank the Lutron Center for allowing us to host us in this space. And a huge thank you to the Crux Alliance for providing us with these wonderful speakers. With that, we will be here for another hour. If you have questions, I know there were a number of questions that did not get answered. I'm sorry, we ran out of time in the best possible way. But we will be here for another hour. And then again, if you were able to stay, if you have not seen a light demonstration, it is super cool. I still have some things that are doing, so we would love for you to invite you to stay. Also, there is still food outside and coffee. So if you are moving or leaving the space, we hope that you leave hydrated and caffeinated. So thank you again, everyone.